Hi, my name is Margaret Welsh. I am the founder and director at Sacred Garden Educational Pathways, and I'm excited to be giving everyone a talk on understanding, especially from a Catholic perspective, and specifically for students who have learning difficulties. We are also going to be looking at two gifts that particularly Catholics can recognize when working with students who have learning difficulties that I think are really amazing and are good for us to recall, especially when the days get tough. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and show you guys some visuals because visuals really help me. We're going to start off by looking at understanding in general, more of a scientific view. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm going to preface it with that. Just if you have any further questions that are more related to science, then go ahead and reach out to someone who's going to have a little bit more know-how in that area. So we're going to look at more of the scientific view, and then we're going to switch to the philosophical understanding of understanding, which is more helpful for me usually when I'm working with students who have learning difficulties. And all of this is going to be in light of our understanding of man in light of our Catholic faith. So just before we begin all of that, we believe that man is both body and soul, that our soul is made in the image and likeness of God, and that we are destined for heaven. This is not the only shot we get at happiness. We are made for something greater and something higher, and that's really important to keep in mind. So we're going to be approaching this from that perspective. It's a very blessed perspective because not everyone has this perspective. Not everyone can see beyond the everyday to a higher goal, a greater goal. And that's, I think, very hopeful when working with students who have learning difficulties, or if you have a student who has learning difficulties, is seeing the ultimate goal, not necessarily the daily ins and outs. So let's go ahead and look at the slides that I have. We're going to again start off with the more scientific view of understanding. So according to the scientific view, we get a sensory impulse that then sends that message up to our brain, and then we have neurological connections that are made because of that sensory impulse. And you can see, according to this brain map, and there are other brain maps out there that are more detailed, but according to this brain map, there are different sections in our brain that process different pieces of information. And then ultimately those different sections collaborate together to get like a big picture of whatever we're trying to understand. And this is the area where you're going to see weaknesses in the processing that a student might have that's causing a learning disability. Some students might be able to visually process everything easily, but then once they try to assimilate that information and make a judgment about it, a choice about that information, then they fall short. They're not able to do that. Or some students are able to perform, to have very great attention, but then their visual processing center isn't working very well. And so they're able to attend really well, but then trying to decipher what they're seeing is very difficult. So this is, again, more of a modern perspective, more of a scientific approach. We get a sensory impulse from the outside. That message gets sent to the brain, and then we have neurological connections that are made throughout the different parts of the brain. They work together to get a big picture of the information that we received from outside. I like to look at more of the philosophical view, and I'm going to drag my face down so you guys can see this. So this slide is called The Faculties of the Soul and Body, and I think it's very helpful to see the philosophical side of how understanding takes place, because this isn't looking at the different parts of the brain that work. It's looking at the entire process from start to beginning, and this actually takes into account that we are both body and soul. The scientific point of view doesn't necessarily look at the soul part of that and the final act of understanding that's necessary. So this is very helpful, I think, in having a visual and a concept of how we understand according to philosophy. And this particular model was designed by Aristotle. He was one of the first ones who laid out how the process of thought takes place. He wrote an entire book on it. It's called De Anima, or On the Soul. And many, many philosophers and theologians have used his work in their writings. So, and it still holds true even today, and you're going to actually see that. I know I went very briefly and quickly over the scientific understanding, but you're going to see that they actually line up and complement one another, and this goes even further than what science can tell us. So we start with the five senses. We get a sensory impulse or sensory information, and then that gets assimilated. The common sense is kind of a stepping stone. If you see something and hear something from the same thing at the same time, then you want to make sure that those two impulses are kind of combined into one, coming from one place, instead of your mind thinking they're from separate places. So this is kind of a stepping stone. It's not super important. But you get a sensory impulse, and then the first thing you're supposed to do is make an image of that in your mind. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to understand something that's outside of you. So when you perceive something that's outside of you, then you need to replicate that in your mind. And making that image is really important. So you make that image, then you send that information to the memory, and you can retrieve information from the memory, compare old memories with the new information, and figure out if there's a likeness, a difference, what's going on there. And then the cogitative power is where you take the new information that you've had and you refine it, you abstract it more so that it's more of a pure image. It's more of the whatness of the thing versus this particular thing. And I'll go through a couple examples a little bit later so that you can see what this means. But you make an image, you compare it to past memories, you store it in your memory. You should be able to recall those past images, and then you use your cogitative power to refine the image so that it's exactly what you need. And then the final step is the act of understanding, where you take this refined image and you are able to grasp it in its entirety usually. And this final act of understanding takes place in the soul. And then through the final act of understanding, you're able to make a choice about the new information, and then that choice gets sent down through your brain again, and you're able to act on that. So it's important to remember that there's a distinction here. If you can imagine a line in between the top box and all of the lower ones, that's a really important distinction, because all of the processing that occurs where you're refining the image and figuring out kind of what to send to the intellect, all of that process goes on in our material brain. So we receive a sensory impulse from something outside of us that we perceive through our senses. Then all that processing goes on in our brain. And then once all that processing is finished, then that information gets sent to the intellect, which is actually our soul. And then the will is also seated in the soul. That's not part of our body. That's part of the immaterial part of us that God has given us, that gift. And when so I'll walk through a couple examples, and then we'll go into what this means for students with learning difficulties. So if you see a chair, you can see that if you see a particular chair, it might be a wooden chair, it might be a plastic chair. You perceive it, you make an image of that particular chair in your mind, and then you compare it to past chairs and figure out, okay, this has 4 legs, it has a back, it has a seat. These are my images of other chairs that I've seen in the past. And then, so that's the comparison between the imagery and the memory. And then with the cogitative, what you do is you eliminate the unnecessary parts of that. And you say, okay, I don't really need to worry about the color. I don't need to worry about the material of the chair. What I need to worry about to figure out that it's a chair is that it has 4 legs, a back, and a seat. And then that refined image that's more abstract, it's closer to the idea of the whatness of the thing and farther away from the idea of this particular chair. That abstracted image gets sent to the intellect, and you have an understanding of the chair. And then you're able to act on that. Should I sit down in the chair? Should I not sit down in the chair? It's up to you what you do at that point. Or if you're reading a book and you're looking up a definition of a new word, you're going to make a picture of that word in your mind, what it means to you, what imagery you associate with it. So for something like justice, you might be picturing the statue of justice holding the scales, or you might be seeing that those who do good are rewarded, those who do evil are punished. And your idea of justice gets sent to the intellect and you understand that concept, and then you're able to act on that. How do I act justly in this situation? And then you act upon your knowledge. So the streamlined version of how we understand is you go through all this processing in your brain, you understand something, and then you act upon the knowledge. And that process is very important. Now, before we dive into what this means for students with learning difficulties, I want to go a little bit further with understanding and figure out, okay, what are we called to understand? Because that's really important in also the big picture of working with students who have learning difficulties. So when we're understanding, we have a discursive process where we understand things that are closer to us, easier for us to see first, and then we move away from those closer to the how do I put this? Closer to the more perfect knowledge and the higher knowledge. So picture is helpful. When you're babies, or even when you're children, you know things that are in the visible world around you very easily. And then you move away from that as you grow up, and you move closer to seeing the realities of the faith, hopefully. So you want your knowledge to build upon itself so that you come to a closer and closer understanding of the faith, not just the material world around us, which is what many people in this post-Christian society focus on. Is they want to know what's around them, they want to know how to interact with the world, and they're not necessarily looking beyond that, which is what we're called to do. Because knowing the world, yes, is good, but then knowing who created the world is even better. So you're looking forward to that, and you use academics in order to climb up to that level. So eventually you don't want to only know the world around you, you want to know God. And going back to the image over here, that corresponds with when we're asked the catechism question, why God make you? The response is, God made me to know him, to love him, and to serve him. And the first part of that response is to know him. So this actually corresponds with the operation which we use in order to understand something and then to make a choice about it. We are called to know God and then to love him because we know him. And the knowledge that we have of him for each one of us is going to be different in this life. But we are called to know him more and more each day. And that's kind of what we're aiming at as Catholics, is not just to improve our knowledge so that we can succeed in academics or succeed in the world, but to improve our knowledge so that we can grow closer to God, which is really beautiful and really amazing. And then to choose to love him and to serve him because we love him, so that we can be happy with him in the next. So again, we're not called to just know him and love him in this life. It's so that we can be happy with him in the next. And I think that's really important for us to remember, because that's what we're called to do. It's our duty. And that's the ultimate goal. It's not just the academics. It's to know and love God, which is really important. And again, not everyone has that perspective. It's a gift that we have as Catholics to be able to see that, to see the end goal where we're trying to get to. And it's important to recognize that. So then kind of stepping back to, okay, what does this mean for students with learning difficulties? This is the amazing part. This is the first gift that I think that God has given us that we can at least recognize as Catholics. It's something that everyone has, but we can recognize it. And it's the fact that we're body and soul. And if we have a weakness in the body, God has given us means to at least strengthen that to a certain extent. And the amazing thing about it's not necessarily amazing for the student who has a learning difficulty, but the amazing thing is that students who have learning difficulties, the difficulty arises from a weakness in the processing, a weakness in the connections that are made up here. It's not a weakness in that final act of understanding where the understanding takes place in the soul. It's a weakness in the material part of us. the part that does the processing, the part that makes the image, the part that stores the image and compares it to other images, the part that refines the image. That's the area where the learning weaknesses occur. It's those connections that are made. There are pathways, processing pathways that are weak, that have been impaired due to whatever reasons in the past. And because of those weaknesses, that final act of the understanding is incomplete, it's imperfect. And that's why you have the difficulties with academics and with learning. And why you see that final act, which is what you're ultimately trying to get to, that's why you see that it's imperfect, is because the processes underneath that are in our brain are weak. And the amazing thing about this is that we can strengthen them. It's similar to preparing for a marathon. You wouldn't wake up tomorrow and say, okay, I'm going to go on a marathon today and be able to run a marathon, unless you're an extremely gifted person physically. I'm not. You have to stretch, you have to exercise a certain way, you have to build up your endurance, you have to build up, your muscle strength, so that when the day of the marathon comes, you can run it without injuring yourself. And it's very similar with our brains. We can strengthen those processing pathways that are weak by exercising them, which is really exciting, because that means that for all the students that I've worked with, all the students that I've seen, and all the reading that I've done, it means that to some extent there is room for improvement, which is really exciting, because oftentimes those who are in the special education world will diagnose a student and then they'll say, okay, well, this is kind of the end of the road. This is what you're always going to have to live with. And well, this is how you can live with this disability. Versus looking at it as kind of the beginning of a journey, which I think is really important to see it like that, because if you think about it as the beginning of a journey, you have somewhere to go, and you have to climb that slope and become better, which is possible. And that's the exciting thing. Even if your student has a diagnosis, there's still room for growth and improvement. It's going to be different for each person. Some students are going to have like a 180 flip. Not all students. And then other students, they're only going to be able to improve a little bit, but there's still room for growth and improvement, which is really, really exciting. The other exciting thing is that we have so many different therapies out there nowadays that are being developed to help students with learning difficulties. So you have vision therapy out there that helps with the visual processing difficulties that students will encounter. You have sound therapy that helps with the auditory processing. You have movement therapy, occupational therapy, nutrition therapy, cognitive therapy. That's what we usually work with, is the cognitive therapy. You have all these different therapies out there that are there to help the students improve, to help the students get to that higher level of achievement that you're hoping for. And again, that's so exciting, because it doesn't mean that a diagnosis is the end of the road for you guys, and it's always going to be like this. It means that it's the beginning of a journey through which, if you figure out the weaknesses that are going on, you can help improve those weaknesses. And yes, you might get to a certain point where you say, okay, well, this is as much progress as we're going to make, so let's figure out what accommodations we need and how to work within the abilities that we have. But you still would have made progress from the initial diagnosis to what you have now. Again, not everyone is necessarily going to make a whole lot of progress. I've seen a lot of progress in students, though, and I would encourage you to try this route of remediation, because there is so much room for growth. And it's a gift that God has given us. He's given us the means and the ability to improve ourselves, not only so that we can succeed better academically, which is usually the primary goal when we're thinking about students with special education needs, but also to improve so that we can grow to know God better and better. And that might mean that some students come to know and love God through looking at beautiful images and hearing beautiful music. Other students might go on to read the Summa. There's a whole range in between there. But God has given us the means to try to perfect ourselves, to strive after perfection here on earth. And He's given us the ability to improve our body, which is the part of us that interacts with the outside world, so that we can increase our knowledge and our love. ultimately. And again, that's looking at kind of the big picture and ultimately what we're hoping for. So again, going back to the learning weaknesses occur, when a student isn't able to make that image. This happens often. In fact, this is one of the biggest weaknesses that I've seen with students is they can't make this image, whether it be the proper image of letters when they're trying to visualize a word, or whether it's making a corresponding image to a story. They can't imagine what the story is about. They can't see the characters in the story. They can't answer questions about the story. And you'll see this a lot in students. Other students have a hard time with that memory connection. So they're able to make that image, but then storing it and retrieving it is really difficult. So then you have to figure out how to exercise that a certain way so that pathway gets stronger. Other students have a difficulty with analyzing something, using logic, refining that image. And so you have to help them strengthen that by sorting that information, doing sorting techniques and stuff like that, so that they can refine the image better and use the image the right way so that they have a better understanding of things. And then, like I said before, you have the vision therapy that has to do with the sensory to the brain connection, the auditory to the brain connection. And then you have something like nutrition therapy that helps with, if you go back to this idea, there are those connections that need to be made, and there are chemical connections, there are neurological connections that need to be made. And if there's an improper chemical balance in the brain or an improper nutrition due to whatever reasons, then those connections are going to be hard to make. So that's where something like nutrition therapy comes into play, is when you need to make those connections and make them stronger, and you need that chemical balance there in order to do that. You'll see this with students who have ADHD. You'll see them being given medication usually to help correct some of those chemical imbalances. But if you could even go a step further backwards and say, okay, well, what's causing these chemical imbalances? Okay, let's fix these through diet or something like that. And then you even have, in this image, you don't have it necessarily, but you can use the body as well to help integrate some of those connections in the brain, because our brain has to send out messages for our body to move. And if we force our body to move in a certain way, it'll force the brain to make those connections a certain way. So all of this is, in a sense, exercising those weak pathways in the brain, similar to it would be to stretch, exercise, build up your endurance, build up your muscle strength for running a marathon, which is just amazing. And again, if you can strengthen the mental processing that's in here, then you're going to have a better connection and a more complete understanding of things, which is really exciting. So the strengthening the material part of us will make the understanding in our soul even more perfect, which is what you're ultimately going for. But again, thinking of this as not the end of the road, but the beginning of a journey is really important. And also seeing the gift that God's given us, that we can improve ourselves with his help. And especially in these times when all these new therapies are coming out, this is a really exciting time, because there are more and more opportunities to improve ourselves, which I think is just really exciting. And again, understanding how the final act of understanding is in our soul. Not everyone has that concept of that. Not everyone out there in the non-Christian society can see that connection, and that the mental processing needs to be transferred. And that's why you need to have better mental processing to have a more perfect understanding of something, and then ultimately choose that and use that understanding to hopefully grow in love of God. So I wanted to give you guys kind of that hope and that excitement that there's so much out there that we can use, that God has given us, to help students who have learning difficulties. And again, it's not the end of the road, it's the beginning of the journey. It might be a tough journey, it might be an uphill battle sometimes, but still just having that knowledge that there is growth and improvement available for your students is really helpful. And I've seen so many students, we exercise certain weaknesses and they start being able to use those pathways, and then their confidence goes up, and then they're more ambitious, and their independence improves, and they're able to do more on their own, and they want to do more on their own. And there's a lot of hope for them. So again, if your student has a diagnosis, don't think of it as, well, you're always going to have this diagnosis, at least to the severity, so this is what we have to do, you're just going to have to live with it. Think about it as, okay, well, what can we do to improve this at least some? and raise that level of achievement that you can have. So hopefully that's really exciting for you guys to hear that. It was exciting for me when I recognized the connection, how we think as human beings, the way God has designed us to think, and the abilities that He has given us to improve ourselves. So it was very beautiful for me to see that when I first started working with students, and even now when I work with students. And then the second thing to remember is that, again, we start by understanding things that are around us. That's what we know. And then we move to things that are more knowable and closer to God, which is higher. That's what we're ultimately designed for. We're made for heaven. We're not necessarily made for this earth. And we should use this earth to get to heaven. And so the other thing to keep in mind is that, I'm going to let you guys see this. Stop touching my computer for a sec. This is a beautiful quote by St. Bonaventure. It's not letting you see the top part. Well, I'm going to read it to you. It says, if you know everything except Christ, you learn nothing. If you learn nothing except Christ, you learn everything. And that's another thing to think about, when you're working with students who have learning difficulties, and students who may have more severe learning difficulties. What do you introduce them to? Are you going to focus on the academics, which is important in functioning society? But what about also, and you're probably already doing this, but filling their lives with beautiful images, with beautiful music, with going to church and hearing things and just knowing God in the ways that they can. And again, some individuals are going to know God through looking at beautiful pictures and hearing beautiful music, and others are going to be able to read the Summa at some point and be able to know God that way. And even within each of our own spiritual lives, we're going to know God differently. But then ultimately, we get to choose to love God, which is beautiful because each and every one of us, regardless of whether we have physical disabilities, mental disabilities, personality issues, just severe struggles in life, or we just have ups and downs throughout life, we're always able to choose God. And that part of us that is made in the image likeness of God, our soul, no matter what difficulties we have externally, we are always going to be able to have a spiritual life inside of us, and we're always going to be able to choose God, no matter who we are or what we're dealing with. And that's the other beautiful gift that God has given us that as Catholics we can recognize, because think about all these families out there who have students who have learning difficulties, and all they see is the everyday. They only see their students struggling with academics, and they don't necessarily think about or recognize the fact that their student is not necessarily meant for this world. They're meant for heaven, and they can choose God. There isn't that capacity for hope and love in that respect that we as Catholics can have. And it's really beautiful. You have the example, there were many saints who had varying degrees of academic learning. And again, when you're thinking about special education, you're thinking about academics. But when you look beyond that, it's very hopeful because you have many different saints throughout the centuries. Some of them are very, very learned. Some of them are not very learned. And you even have the example of St. Joseph of Cupertino. If you haven't seen the movie The Reluctant Saint or read about him, you should, because he's an amazing saint. But he was an individual who probably had several different learning disabilities that they weren't able to diagnose back then. And his mental capacity, at least externally, was limited. He wasn't able to interact with people very well. He wasn't able to focus. He wasn't able to remember things or retain information. And yet he grew to a very high level of sanctity, was made a priest, and there are so many miracles associated with him. He is like the perfect example of someone who had learning disabilities, but was able to reach a high level of sanctity despite those learning difficulties. And for him, the academics didn't necessarily matter. It was love of God. And that's the gift that we have, is that each and every one of us can choose to love God regardless of where we are with our knowledge of him. So yes, we are called to better ourselves and increase our knowledge, but we're also called to love him. And even within our faith, there are times when we're not going to know. We love God based on our faith that we have. And that's what, children have in God when they're younger. And then they grow to be able to know more about God so they can choose to love him more. But that's the other beautiful thing that we can remember, is that even if the daily ins and outs can be really difficult, and the academic abilities, they're going to be different for each person. Some students are going to be able to succeed with academics, which hopefully is the case. Other students are going to be able to exceed at least some with academics, and some individuals, at least externally, it doesn't seem like they have a whole lot of interaction with academics or with the outside world very much. But each and every one of us can choose God along the way. And that's the really encouraging thing, the really hopeful thing that I have thought about in working with students who have learning difficulties, is that yes, they might have a really difficult day, but they're ultimately not made just for this life. They're made for heaven. And there's going to be such a great reward in heaven if we choose to love him here on earth. And I know I'm sounding a little bit preachy right now, but for me, it's very hopeful to see this, because then you can see the greatness of each person and the hope that each person has, regardless of where they are on their journey. So hopefully this has been an informative talk. It's hopefully given you more information about how we understand, and how that understanding and the processing in our brain interacts with our soul, and the final seat of understanding. And then also what this means with regard to living our lives as Catholics, and seeing our students who are Catholics who struggle with learning difficulties and learning needs, seeing that, again, their journey throughout life, it may be a little bit more difficult. There's room for growth, and that through that journey, surrounding them with beautiful images, beautiful music, beautiful churches, a beautiful faith is going to get them even farther than academics will. So yes, with academics, there's something so exciting that we can improve ourselves. And then on the other side, with whatever progress mark we make, we're still able to love God and become saints. All of us are called to be saints. So I hope you enjoyed the talk. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Again, just keep in mind, a diagnosis is not the end of the road. It's the beginning of a journey where you can figure out, okay, what are the weaknesses that my student is dealing with? How can we try to improve those? Because we have so many tools nowadays, and God has given us an amazing body that can grow and improve, so that we can know things better, and ultimately so that we can know him better here on earth. And then God has also given us the gift of our free will and our soul, our free will within our soul, where we, regardless of what difficulties we're encountering here on earth, for any of us, we can still choose to love him and become saints, hopefully one day. So anyway, I hope this has been an informative talk. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. It's been a pleasure giving this talk, and enjoy the rest of the talks. God bless.